So today we're gonna go over some bike maintenance. We're only 1 week away from my first race of the season. So we're gonna strip this bike completely apart and make sure everything's running top notch. And I'm gonna show you guys how to work on your bike and make sure it's ready to perform when you have a big race ahead. So this bike is pretty grimy. I haven't taken it apart or really given it a proper clean since Grands. We have Circle City BMX coming up. We're only 1 week away, and you don't want to roll up to a new race with a grimy chain, some dusty ass brakes, a gritty sounding drivetrain. We can't have that. When you show up to a race, you want to have your bike at top notch. I don't care if you're 11-year-old novice, 16-year-old intermediate, or a top pro. Never roll to the track with a dirty bike. You don't see Ken Roxon or Eli Tomac ever rolling out to a stadium with a dirty bike, right? So let's get into it. I got an 8mm and I got a 3-way, and luckily that's all the tools you really need to take a bike apart nowadays. I lied, I also need a 17 because I put big bolts on my back wheel. Go ahead and disconnect your brakes. I'm gonna leave the handlebars connected to the stem because sometimes it's hard to get your bars back exactly where they were. So I'm gonna just take the stem off because there's nothing in there I'm worried about having to clean. When you take your spacers out, make sure you remember the order of your spacers. The brake cable is ran internally through the top tube, so I don't want to take that out. Also with the chain, I don't want to break the chain. Unless you have a master link. If you have a master link, there's no problem taking your chain on and off. But with this chain, I would have to push a pin out. When you're pushing a pin in or out of the chain, you're taking away very little bits of metal in that hole that keeps the pin tight. So more you take it in and out, the more loose it's going to become. And then eventually you might break a chain. No one wants that. I have a stack of old t-shirts. So anytime you have an old t-shirt, put it in a little box in your garage because they work great as rags. I'm gonna go through the head tube, wipe out all the old grease. You obviously don't have to go this far and take grease out and put new grease in, but when it comes to a race weekend, remember, either you or your parents spend a lot of money to be there. Make sure your bike's dialed, so if you go and lose, that's because you didn't do your sprints last week, not because of a bike failure. I have this stuff from Slick Products. This spray is like a silicone. It's just a coating that helps clean, and it also leaves like kind of a slick layer over the whole bike. It makes dirt like not stick as easy, I guess. Don't forget, even get down on your seat tube a little bit. Don't forget where you have your bike mounted. It also needs to be cleaned, so. This thing is so light. I forget how light these carbon bikes are. Holy cow. Another trick, kids, use your old toothbrush because it works great to clean in little tight cracks. You ever been to a supercross race and seen the supercross bikes, like they're sitting there in the pits and they look like they've never seen dirt? This is why they take care of their shit. Well, they have people to do it for them, but we don't have that because we ride BMX. Ooh, perfect example. My dropout's loose. Prime reason we take our bikes apart and clean them. It's definitely not the bike's fault. I haven't checked these since I've been riding this bike for almost 2 years now, and I've never checked these bolts. So we're gonna take them fully off. Kids with a carbon bike, be aware. Dirt gets down in there too, so we want to clean that. I completely overlooked that. We're gonna go ahead and do the other side too, just in case. Rub the rag into your bottom bracket because you want to make sure you get any old grease out of there because we're going to put new grease in. Check your bearings. If you feel the bearings like don't spin perfectly smooth, you might need to pull those out and clean them or get new bearings. If the bearings don't feel smooth, tell your parents, mom, dad, feel these. They feel kind of grimy because you can get a new set of bearings way cheaper than you can get a whole new bottom bracket, so just keep that in mind. Mine feels pretty dialed. I run the Avian crankset, and these bearings still feel perfect after like 2 years of riding them. So I like to get a little carb cleaner, carb choke, parts cleaner. You can get this stuff from Walmart pretty cheap. It sprays fast. Just don't get it in your eyes. When I spray it in there, carb cleaner will really break up all the gunk that's in your brake cable. Spray a bunch on the top, let it drip down in there. I'm working up high so it will slowly work itself down the cable. If your brakes feel really tight and just gross to pull. Majority of the time it's just a dirty ass cable. So try this first. If it's really bad, I would take your cable fully off and like hold it up, pull the cable out and spray it down in the cable housing so it really flow through there and get all the grime out. Don't forget like the little noodle on the end too. I'm also gonna use the carb cleaner. I'm gonna spray this chain. You can take it off and like soak it in like a little bucket of gasoline and that'll just break down any grime that's on there. But we're not gonna do that. We're gonna take some shortcuts. This doesn't clean it properly. It doesn't really get all the grime out of like the inner links as it should, but I'm gonna put a new chain on because I'm out of chains. When you do this, it's gonna get crap all over your chainstay as well, so we'll have to go back through and wipe that off. See if you can hear this noise. Can you hear that? The sound of a loose chain, you know, like the little pieces of metal are touching. That means it's not gummy and it's just sticking together. That's just, everything's kind of moving free. That's how I like to kind of judge it. We'll go back and re-lube that at the end of this whole process. Ooh, that feels good. Let's start with putting our cranks back on. Got my tub of grease. Make sure everything's nice and clean in the spindle. How good looking is a Renin chain ring? No ugly powder coat on it. Just all anodized and clean, straight to the point. Avian cranks. And actually spray painted the spider black because the crank arm was polished and the spider was polished, which I didn't like. I hate the look of a polished spider, but say a black chain ring. So I taped that off and I just sprayed it. And now it just looks all dialed. Looks like it's all one piece. It's the little things. Can you see that grime in the teeth? We want to get rid of all that stuff. All that grime is just old dirt and old grease and little fragments of metal that's fallen off. Because if you get all this off and your chain is running smoother through each tooth, that means there's less friction against each tooth. As your sprocket is spinning, each chain link a little smoother, which in return your cranks are getting around faster. 1%ers, people. Lube up the old spindle. Doesn't have to be thick. I also like to put a little bit inside the cups. I like to put a little bit on the outside of the bearings too, like on the seal. Because when you put it on the seal is obviously made to keep dirt out. That's just one extra layer of protection for dirt not to get down in there. Make sure with these little sleeves, make sure you grease under those sleeves as well. You slide that sleeve back on. Now we're not gonna go crazy on the splines. Get enough to pack some grease down the spline so when you put the left crank arm on, if it's just metal on dry metal on metal, that's just gonna make it wear down a little easier and it's gonna make it creak. All these little greasing tactics are gonna help prevent your bike from creaking. If you're pedaling your bike and it just sounds like garbage, you probably just need to get in there and either need new bearings or get in there and just grease everything. Usually that noise of creaking and is just dry, bare material, either like carbon on carbon or metal on carbon or metal on metal. That's what's creating that just gross noise in your bike. We're gonna run our finger inside the crank arm, get anything out of those splines. Make sure there's no dirt down in the pedal ball. I got some dirt still between my spider and my crank. So we're gonna put a little bit of grease on the spline on this side too. When you put the pinch bolt back on the left crank arm, I actually try to wipe as much grease out of those threads as possible. Some people might disagree, I don't know. It doesn't, because once this pinch bolt is tight and has your left crank arm tight to the spindle, none of that moves, and I don't really want this to be greased because I don't want it to have the tendency to break itself loose like after vibration or riding. So I actually like to put that in there with dry threads so it just kind of sticks in there a little better and doesn't have the tendency to break loose over time. We're not gonna crank down on this, so hold the cranks one in each hand and move back and forth. You should be able to feel a little bit of back and forth play. So just slowly tighten it, like tighten that bolt until it's snug, don't wrench, and then feel it. If there's no play, go a hair past that. That bolt brings your cranks together. It keeps it all tight. But you have the crank arm pinch bolts that squeeze the crank arm to the spindle, and that's what's keeping your cranks from falling off. So you don't want to over tighten this left crank arm, which is binding your bearings and then making your bearings tight and not spin so free. Because if you go too tight and then it's cramping down on your bearings, your cranks are gonna be harder to spin. So it's like the chain going through the teeth. Like, you want all this to spin smooth, so when you go to pedal, there's no friction against your legs trying to pedal fast. So make sure all this spin's free, don't over tighten this, and you should be good to go. And it's tight, I feel no movement. We're gonna tighten up these pinch bolts, do one side, then do the other side, and then go back and forth. 2 each side. I'm gonna go doing 3 on each side. You don't wanna over tighten these, just really kind of feel it. Because as you tighten one side, it's pulling the crank a little tighter, so the other one's gonna get loose. Cranks are dialed. Another one, before we move on, I can't stress this one enough. Check your chainring bolts. You don't want loose chainring bolts. I run the Renin sprocket that has actually a little lip on the sprocket, so when you put it in the spider, it already has something to hold itself in there. See, every one of my chainring bolts just turned a hair. Back when I was younger, I was at a race in Florida, and I just got my first brand new pair of Shimano Saint cranks when this style crank came out, and like all the pros had that crank set, and like your bike was dialed if you had Shimano Saint cranks on. My chainring bolts came loose. I snapped out of the gate, and all this just ripped to shred. I like tacoed the sprocket. I snapped one of the little tabs off the spider. The bent sprocket dug into my frame. I'm sure my dad was pissed because he had to go buy me some new cranks. So yeah, tighten your chainring bolts. We're gonna move to the seat. It seems so basic. Maybe you've been in a situation where you're pedaling your bike and you can't figure out why it's creaky. You take your bottom bracket apart, you clean your chain, you do all this and you can't figure out why. When you pedal, all this flexes, and believe it or not, that flex does run up to your seat post, and it can be something as so simple as this little bit of material is flexing on itself, and a lot of your creaking could come from your seat post clamps. Take your quick release apart, make sure there's no grime, metal on metal with dirt and little rocks in between. Plenty of grease in there. Everything's moving free. I'm also gonna come in and put a super thin layer of grease around the seat post. Don't hold back, don't get stingy on the grease. Being a little older, I run my seat a little higher. If I sit down all the way and my seat's slammed, it kind of just hurts my knees if I sit there too long. So I like to run my seat a little higher. So I'm not gonna grease it. We're gonna run it about an inch or so. Now we're gonna come through and I'm just gonna wipe off any excess grease. You don't want grease hanging out because grease is gonna grab dirt and it's just gonna collect even more dirt around these areas and it's gonna look gross. Cranks are dialed, seat's on. Look at these bearings. This dirt is just sitting on top of the seals. We don't wanna push it down into the seals. Rub it right off the top. Can't hear anything because it's that smooth. We're gonna take some grease, put on the inside of the cups. So we got the inside greased from the bearing to the frame, and now let's put a little bit of grease on the actual bearing where your fork is gonna sit at the top. Everything's got its covers, but dirt still works itself in there. So that's why you gotta take the bike apart and really get all the dirt that really works itself like inside all the tubing that you can never get. Remember our order on how these spacers came out. So then we have the top cup. You know, this isn't just about like your BMX race bike. You might have like a 26-inch dirt jumper or just a freestyle like skate park BMX bike. Everything needs to be clean, you know, take care of your stuff. It'll take care of you. So the same process works across the board. Know what I'm saying? Now, our fork. Look at all that dirt. It binds up. If you don't wipe that off, you're just gonna stick that right back into your nice bike. It's gonna get stuck in between the bearings. Really need to get some gloss forks. Should probably order some. Let's put some grease on this bottom race. Remember I had the big spacer under the stem. Make sure you get all your gunk out of your stem too. I just let whatever excess is inside the head tube when I push it through, I just let that. It's like nice, a little coating. I don't want to do too much. I like thinking it's too grease, maybe your bars will slip. I don't know, I could be crazy, but it's got a little coating and that's enough for me. Some things, I don't want them to move at all. Ooh, brake lever. I don't want to take the brake lever off because there's a spring inside the bolt that bolts the lever to the perch. Again, be careful where you spray this stuff. It will remove paint. I want to spray some. The cable goes through. Watch your face. We'll go through the other side. We get up in the lever too where the cable actually sits. So this is one you might not have ever seen. Maybe you never thought about it. Get a little bit of grease and I'm gonna grease this little head from our brakes. Because when your brake lever is pulling this cable, this little knob is rotating inside there. Again, that's dry metal on carbon. Because the more it just does that dry, it's gonna eat away at the material. So I'm gonna grease that just a little bit. So when I put the cable in the lever, it just moves nice and free inside there. Little stuff like that is why this bike has lasted me almost 2 years now. Throw the front wheel on. Check the bearings real quick. The Profile Elites are super easy. Just slide in and out, super easy. So you can get in there, make sure there's no grime, and put a little grease inside that bearing. So when we slide this back on, we're gonna do some grease inside that little collar as well. Put some grease on the forks. Once it's all tight, it doesn't move, but it does flex, and flex can cause creaking. Now that the wheel is on, start at the valve stem and just go between all your spokes. You roll up to the gate, first Moto International, and your competition's got a dirty ass bike. He looks over and your bike looks super pro and clean. You're already in his head. Oh man, I bet his bike's gonna run smoother. He's probably gonna beat me. We're doing this one purely for the cosmetic horsepower. You do not want to do this on your back wheel. Well, a lot of you guys have disc brakes, so just don't let it get on the disc, but do it in a direction like hits it and goes away. It doesn't actually go on top of the tire. You don't want it on the tire getting slick. We'll take the toothbrush and go in between the tire and the rim. Ooh! Now those logos are popping. Stem is not tight yet because obviously can't see if my handlebars are straight fully, so we're gonna tighten that when we get it off the rack. Now to the back. Grease where the aluminum dropout sits against the carbon. I'm gonna do a very fine layer. I'm gonna put a little bit of blue Loctite on these bolts. You put a little grease on the bolt head, so when the bolt head sits against the carbon, it ain't gonna creak. Don't over tighten these. This chain can stay off the front sprocket, but make sure it's at least sitting on the back end. Tilt this a little bit. I've always been one to run my chain a little loose. The Renin chain rings have a little thicker tooth, so it really holds the chain on a lot better. When the chain is too tight, it's just friction against your sprocket. It's pulled way too tight. It's making it feel like it's kind of almost a little harder of a gear. Just enough tension to bring the chain all the way back. I do the right side first. If it moves it, then pull your wheel straight, tighten your left side. So since the left side is tight, we're gonna break the right side loose. Then we use our left hand and I'm gonna push the wheel. You can push the wheel this way, which pushes the axle back because it pivots off that side. I can't push it off. If I push it in enough, it wants to grab the teeth, but it's fine. Wheel straight, so we're really gonna crank down this right side. I don't even have chain tensioners on this frame because I made the back end a little shorter than normal, so I couldn't fit them in there. So that's why I upgraded to these like big bolts, so I could really kind of get some leverage on that bolt. So once that's tight, your chain's dialed. If you need to adjust, just adjust with the left side. I don't really like to use a really thick chain lube, just because I like to think it's a thick lube might cause a little bit of drag, so I like to use kind of a thin one. This is an old bottle of ProLink. I don't even know if this company's around. Doesn't last as long, but I think it allows it to spin a little more free. It's not as good as I like, but whatever. With these carbon frames, you don't want to scratch carbon or really have deep scratches because it weakens the carbon. So I actually got a little piece of sticky Velcro. I used the soft side and I actually put some Velcro up under there. Since I run my chain loose, when it does rattle, it hits that and you don't really hear it hitting the frame. All right, clean this back rim real quick. I'm not gonna lube the back wheel, but I'm gonna use the toothbrush just to get in between the rim and the tire where dirt kind of gets down there and sits. I wipe the brakes down. I take a little bit of grease and I just grease up these little arms. Make sure the pins are in the same holes on both sides. I like to do the middle hole. Remember, we use the carb cleaner to dry out the cable. Now it's a dry cable inside of a dry housing, so we want to put a little bit of lube down in there. Again, I'm going to use really thin stuff because you don't want it to gum up inside the housing. I'm going to do the same on the back. Just put it right on the cable. It'll stay on that and it'll just run. Work itself down in the housing. Especially the noodle, because that's where it comes through and makes a 90-degree turn into your V-brakes. So it gets a little tighter, more friction, so you want to make sure it's sliding. The barrel up here on the lever, I'm gonna take it out about a little over half, about 3/4 of the way. Not all the way out, obviously, because then it'll break off if it hangs out too much. So I'm gonna run that all the way out, which shortens the cable. Now I'm gonna put the cable on the brakes, and I'm gonna squeeze them where they're touching the rim. I'm just gonna snug it up. With that snugged up all the way against the rim and this out, there's really no room, right? The brakes are locked up. We're gonna take this, break this back loose. I'm gonna run that in, which extends your cable. In a frig, just a little pull, boom, brakes are there. And it's not touching because my wheel's straight. Further out it is, more you come in, more movement you'll have in your lever. Make sure that cable bolt is nice and tight. It's not even a credit card gap between my brakes. Pedals, I have my brand new HTX2s, the SX. The SX is the BMX model, stiffer springs. So if you look here, I'm actually only running them about half tension. So as these pedals wear out, I have plenty of room to crank down on the springs even more. I saw a guy at Grands this year, he actually broke his pedals because there was just so much tension on them and they snapped right before the night show. And that rider was Tyler Brown right before our main event. And me being the good fellow competitor, I took my HTs off my cool down mountain bike that I had out there and I gave Tyler my pedals to use for the race. And he went on to beat myself and Mosquito and take the vet title. Just a little bit of grease on the spindle. You don't have to crank down on them. They don't have to be super tight. Give them a little snug. You don't have to wrench down on them. Pedals have directional threads. They're made not to unscrew. We're good. Finish tightening our headset down. Make sure bars are straight. Tighten one side. Go tighten the other side and then go back. And here it is. My race bike is like brand new, race ready. Go clean your bike, get it all dialed, and we'll see you guys next week in Dothan. Peace.